Africa, a land that Europe believed was theirs to take. By the late 19th century, the most powerful empires in the world were dividing it, piece by piece. Britain, France, Germany, and among them, a rising power, Italy. They wanted an empire. They wanted glory. And they believed Africa would be easy. Most of the continent had already fallen. Kingdoms collapsed. Leaders defeated. Resistance crushed. But one land remained, unconquered, unbroken. Ethiopia. A kingdom that refused to bow. A people that refused to kneel. And at its center stood a king, Menelik II. Italy believed this would be just another victory, another colony, another flag planted on foreign soil. They were wrong. Because
The king did not think like the others. He did not rush into battle blindly. He watched. He planned. He prepared. And when the time came, he did something no one expected. He united his people, tens of thousands of warriors from across the land. Farmers, soldiers, leaders, all standing together for one purpose: to defend their freedom, to protect their empire, to fight. And then the moment arrived. Two armies facing each other on the highlands of Ethiopia. On one side, a modern European force, disciplined, armed with rifles, artillery, confidence. On the other, an African army, massive, determined, and ready to prove something the world did not believe. The battle began.
gunfire, smoke, chaos.
Italy expected a quick victory.
Instead, they found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, overwhelmed. And one by one, they fell. What happened next shocked the world. Because for the first time in the age of empire, a European army had been defeated. Not in Europe, not by another empire, but in Africa, by an African king. At the Battle of Adwa, Menelik II did something history rarely allowed. He didn't just resist, he won. And in doing so, he changed the story of Africa forever. Before the battle, before the victory, before the world was forced to take notice, there was a race for land, for power, for control. By the late 19th century, Europe was expanding faster than ever before. Industrial power had transformed nations. Weapons were stronger. Armies were larger. And ambition was limitless. Africa became the target. A vast continent, rich in resources, diverse in cultures, and
in the eyes of European empires, waiting to be claimed. This period would later be known as the Scramble for Africa. In just a few decades, European powers carved the continent into pieces. Britain expanded from the north and south. France pushed across the west. Germany entered the race with force, and others followed. Borders were drawn, not by the people who lived there, but by those who wanted to rule it. Kingdoms that had existed for centuries fell. Some resisted, but were crushed by modern weapons. Others were divided, controlled, or slowly absorbed. To Europe, Africa seemed unstoppable, a continent falling, one region at a time. But there was one place that refused to follow this pattern, one empire that stood apart: Ethiopia. Unlike many others, Ethiopia was not easily broken. It had history, it had structure, it had leadership, and most importantly, it had identity. This was not a fragmented land. It was an empire, with deep roots, strong traditions, and a people who understood what was at stake. Ethiopia had faced invasions before. It had survived conflicts, internal struggles, and external threats. And it had learned. Because survival teaches more than peace ever can. At the same time, Europe was not just expanding blindly. It was also negotiating, making treaties, drawing agreements, some fair, many not. And among those agreements was one that would change everything: a treaty between Ethiopia and a European power, Italy. Italy was not as powerful as Britain or France, but it had ambition. It wanted its place among empires. It wanted colonies. And it saw Ethiopia as an opportunity. At first, the relationship appeared peaceful, diplomatic, structured. But beneath the surface, there was something else: a misunderstanding. Or perhaps a deliberate deception. A difference in interpretation that would soon lead to conflict. Because while Ethiopia believed it was maintaining its independence, Italy believed something very different. It believed Ethiopia was becoming its protectorate, its territory, its possession. And that belief would not stay on paper. It would lead to demands, to pressure, to control, and eventually to war. But this time, the story would not follow the pattern Europe expected. Because Ethiopia was not unprepared, and its leader was not unaware. A king was rising, watching, learning, preparing for the moment when diplomacy would end and the future of his empire would be decided by force. Before he faced an empire, before he led one of the most important victories in African history, he was a boy, not born into an easy world, not raised in peace, but shaped by uncertainty. His name was Menelik II. He was born into royalty, a prince of Ethiopia. But even that did not guarantee safety, because power in his world was never stable. As a young boy, Menelik experienced something that would shape his entire life. He was taken, captured, during a conflict between rival rulers, held not as a free prince, but as a political prisoner. A child growing up in captivity
watching, learning,
understanding something most rulers never fully grasp: how fragile power truly is. But captivity did not break him. It hardened him. It forced him to think, to observe, to wait. And eventually, he escaped. Not just physically, but politically. Because when he returned, he did not come back as a child. He came back as someone who understood the game. And from that moment on, Menelik did not rush. He did not act blindly. He built. Slowly. Carefully. He strengthened his position. Expanded his influence. United regions that had long been divided. Because he knew something important. An empire divided is an empire waiting to fall. And if Ethiopia was to survive, it had to stand together. Over time, Menelik rose, from prince to ruler to emperor. And when he finally took the throne, he did not inherit a perfect empire. He inherited a challenge, internal divisions, external threats, and a world that was changing rapidly. Europe was rising, its power expanding, its reach extending further every year. And Menelik saw this clearly. He understood something many others did not, that war was no longer fought the same way. Traditional strength was not enough. Courage alone would not stop an empire. So he adapted. He did not reject change. He used it. Menelik began modernizing his forces. He acquired weapons, rifles, artillery, not to imitate Europe, but to defend against it. At the same time, he built alliances, strengthened diplomacy, negotiated carefully with those who sought advantage. Because Menelik was not just a warrior, he was a strategist, a man who knew that victory is often decided long before the battle begins. And perhaps most importantly, he had vision. He did not see Ethiopia as just another kingdom. He saw it as something worth protecting at any cost. Its independence, its identity, its future. And that belief was not just his own. It spread across regions, across leaders, across people who began to see him not just a ruler, but as a unifier. A leader who could stand against what was coming. Because something was coming. A conflict that would test everything he had built. Everything he had prepared for. Everything he believed in. And when that moment arrived, Menelik II would not hesitate. He would not retreat. He would not submit. Because he had already made his decision. Ethiopia would not fall. It did not begin with gunfire. It began with words. With a document. A treaty that was supposed to bring peace. An agreement between two powers, Ethiopia and Italy. It was called the Treaty of Wuchale. On the surface, it seemed simple. Ethiopia would recognize Italy's control over certain territories. And in return, Italy would recognize Ethiopia's sovereignty. A fair exchange. A balanced agreement.
At least, that is what Ethiopia believed. But there was a problem. Hidden in the text. A single clause, written differently in two languages. In the Amharic version, Ethiopia had the option to conduct foreign relations through Italy.
An option. A choice. But in the Italian version, that same clause said something else. That Ethiopia must conduct foreign relations through Italy. Not a choice, a requirement, a transformation from independence to control, from sovereign empire to protectorate. And this changed everything. At first, the difference was not obvious. Diplomacy continued. Relations remained, on the surface, stable. But Italy began to act as if Ethiopia was already under its authority, communicating with other European powers as if it spoke for Ethiopia, as if Ethiopia no longer stood on its own. But Menelik noticed. Menelik II was not a man who ignored details. He read, he questioned, he compared. And when he realized what had been done, he understood it immediately. This was not a misunderstanding. This was strategy, a silent attempt to take control without war, to claim power through paper instead of force. And Menelik refused. He rejected the Italian interpretation, declared it invalid, made it clear that Ethiopia was not anyone's protectorate. Not now, not ever. For Italy, this was unacceptable. Because by now, it had already made claims, already positioned itself as a colonial power, already told the world that Ethiopia was under its influence. To back down would be humiliation, and empires do not like humiliation. So the pressure began. Diplomatic tension, political maneuvering, and then military movement. Italy started building its presence in nearby regions, sending troops, strengthening positions, preparing not for negotiation, but for war. At the same time, Menelik was doing something else, something far more dangerous for his enemy. He was uniting, calling upon leaders from across Ethiopia, regional rulers, warriors, commanders, men who had once been divided, now standing together. Because this was no longer just a political issue. It was a matter of survival, of identity, of freedom. And Menelik understood something crucial. If Ethiopia fought divided, it would fall. But if it stood united, it could do something no one expected. So he prepared. Weapons were gathered. Armies were organized. Supplies were secured. And across the land, a message spread. This was not just a war. This was resistance. And then, Italy made its move. Confident, armed, certain of victory. Because in their minds, this was already decided. A European army against an African kingdom. The outcome seemed obvious. But they had miscalculated. Because Ethiopia was not unprepared. And Menelik was not the kind of leader they had faced before. The stage was set. The armies were moving. And soon, on the highlands of Ethiopia, two worlds would collide.
not in negotiation, not in diplomacy, but in battle.
The waiting was over. The tension that had been building for months was about to break. Across the highlands of Ethiopia, two armies moved toward each other. One, confident. The other, determined. On one side, Italy, a modern European force, trained soldiers, disciplined ranks, armed with rifles, artillery, and the belief that this would be easy. On the other side, an army unlike anything they expected. Not scattered, not disorganized, but united. Led by Menelik II, and beside him, a queen who refused to stand in the shadows, Empress II Betul. Together, they had brought something extraordinary. An army of tens of thousands, warriors from every region, leaders who would set aside differences, men and women fighting for one purpose: freedom. This was not just a battle.
It was a statement, and both sides knew it. The date? March 1st, 1896. The place? Battle of Adwa. Italy moved first. Its generals? Confident in their strategy. They believed speed would give them the advantage, that a quick, decisive strike would break the Ethiopian forces. But the land was not on their side. The terrain was difficult. Mountains, valleys, unknown paths. And as the Italian troops advanced, they began to lose formation. Units separated. Communication weakened. The plan started to fall apart. Meanwhile, Menelik waited. He had studied the situation, watched their movement, understood their weakness, and when the moment came, he acted. Ethiopian forces moved with precision.
Surrounding, closing in, not as scattered fighters, but as a coordinated army. The Italians realized too late. This was not the battle they expected. Gunfire erupted. Smoke filled the air. The sound of war echoed across the mountains. Italian artillery fired. Rifles cracked through the silence. But the Ethiopian army kept advancing. Wave after wave. Relentless. Fearless. Unstoppable. And then, the turning point. Italian divisions, isolated from each other, cut off, surrounded. What was supposed to be a unified assault became fragmented chaos, and Menelik seized it. His commanders pushed forward. His warriors closed the distance. And suddenly, Italy was no longer attacking. It was trying to survive. The battle intensified. Hand-to-hand combat. Clashing steel. Shouts.
Cries. The kind of chaos no strategy can control. And through it all, Ethiopia did not break. It advanced. Stronger. Faster. More unified than ever. Because this was more than war. This was resistance. This was identity. This was survival. And slowly, inevitably, Italy began to collapse. Their lines broke. Their formations shattered. Their confidence, gone. What remained was retreat. Soldiers fleeing, commanders overwhelmed, an army that had come to conquer, now struggling to escape. By the end, the outcome was undeniable. Italy had been defeated. Not in theory, not in negotiation, but in battle. And not by another European empire, but by Ethiopia, led by Menelik II. The victory was complete, decisive, unquestionable. Thousands of Italian soldiers were killed, captured, or forced into retreat. And for the first time in the age of colonial expansion,
A European power had been defeated on African soil. The world was shocked. Because this was not supposed to happen. Africa was supposed to fall, one region at a time, one empire at a time. But at Adwa, that story was broken. Because one king, one army, one united people had done the impossible. They had won.
The battle was over. The smoke began to clear, and the reality became impossible to ignore. Italy had been defeated. Not delayed, not pushed back, but decisively defeated. On the highlands of Ethiopia, an empire had come to conquer, and instead, it had been broken. For the soldiers who survived, there was no victory to claim, only retreat, only loss. Thousands had fallen. Thousands more were captured. And those who escaped carried with them something even heavier than defeat. They carried the truth that this war had not gone the way Europe expected. Back in Italy, the news hit like a shockwave. The government, stunned. The public, outraged. This was not supposed to happen. This was Europe.
Modern, industrial, superior, or so they believed.
And yet, they had been defeated by an African empire, by a king they had underestimated. The humiliation was undeniable. Political pressure rose. Leaders were questioned. Decisions were challenged. And very quickly, Italy had no choice. It had to respond. Not with more war, but with acceptance. Because continuing the fight risked even greater loss. And so, negotiations began. A new agreement. A new reality. The result was clear. Italy officially recognized the independence of Ethiopia. No conditions, no control, no hidden clauses. What had been attempted through deception had now been reversed through defeat. And for Ethiopia, this was more than victory. It was survival. Its sovereignty remained intact. Its identity preserved. Its future still its own. But the impact did not stop there. Because beyond Ethiopia, the world was watching. Across Africa, the story spread. An African army had defeated a European power. For many, it felt impossible. But now, it was real. A symbol, a moment that proved something powerful. That resistance was not hopeless. That victory was not impossible. And even beyond Africa, in places shaped by colonial rule, the victory at Battle of Adwa became something more than history. It became inspiration, a reminder that power could be challenged, that empires could be defeated. And at the center of it all stood one man, Menelik II, not just as a ruler, but as a leader who had done what few others could. He had faced an empire and won. But perhaps his greatest achievement was not just the victory itself. It was what that victory protected.
A nation, a people, a future that remained free.
History often remembers those who conquer, those who expand, those who build empires by taking from others. But sometimes, history is shaped by those who refuse to be conquered, by those who stand when everyone else falls. Menelik II was one of those leaders. He did not cross oceans to claim foreign lands. He did not build his legacy through domination. He built it through resistance, through protection, through the simple but powerful decision to say no. No to control. No to deception. No to an empire that believed Ethiopia would fall, like so many others. And in doing so, he changed something far greater than the outcome of a single war. He changed a narrative. Because for much of that era, the story seemed clear.
Europe rises. Africa falls. Empire expands. Resistance fails. But at the Battle of Adwa, that story broke. Not slowly, not quietly, but completely. An African empire stood its ground, fought back, and won. And that victory echoed far beyond the battlefield. Across Africa, it became a symbol, a moment of pride in a time of loss, a reminder that strength still existed, that independence was still possible, that the future was not already decided. And even decades later, as new struggles emerged, as movements began to rise, as people across the continent fought for their freedom, the name of Menelik II was still remembered. Not just as a king, but as proof. Proof that resistance could succeed. Proof that unity could overcome power. Proof that history is not always written by the strongest, but sometimes by the most determined. But his legacy is not only about war. Because victory at Adwa was not just destruction, it was preservation. He protected a nation that would remain independent, while much of the continent was divided and controlled. He safeguarded identity, culture, continuity. And that matters, because nations are not only built through conquest, but through survival. And Ethiopia survived because of leadership, because of strategy, because of a decision to prepare, to unite, and to fight only when it mattered most. Today, his story still stands, not as myth, not as exaggeration, but as history, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming power, defiance can shape the future. That even when the odds seem impossible, they are not absolute, and that sometimes one leader, one nation, one moment can change how the world sees itself. Menelik II did not just defend his empire. He redefined what was possible. And that is his legacy.